Okay, hello chess players. Today I'm going to talk about how to play exchange up or exchange down endgames, and I'm going to spend this entire video focusing on one specific endgame, which I think teaches this concept very well. This comes from a game, Vidmar versus Alexander Alekhine, played back in San Remo back in 1930. And I think this is one of the most critical games to study when we're looking at how to play positions where we're at exchange up or exchange down. How do we try to get a fortress? How do we try to get that draw? And of course, how do we try to break through if we're playing the black pieces? How do we play for a win? So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button, click your notification icon. So the first thing that you have to do here when you're playing the white pieces or the black pieces is you have to figure out, like, how do you make progress in this situation? So one of the things that black looks at is he tries to envision positions where he could possibly be winning. So one of black's ideas is to maybe try to get his king all the way down to the f1 square. He's trying to tie everything down and get the king down to the f1 square where he can attack that g2 pawn and maybe get something out of that. And then, of course, as the defender, as the side that is down the material, you're looking at what type of fortresses can I create. So if black is trying to get his king down to this f1 square, maybe we're trying to generate some type of fortress where our knight is on f4 and we're holding the g2 square, and everything is fine. Now, white's next move was actually criticized by Alexander Alekhine. It's this move pawn to h4. Now, what's interesting about this move, pawn to h4, is it's criticized by Alexander Alekhine because he says now white will have two liabilities that he has to defend. He has to defend the pawn on g2, and he has to defend the pawn on h4. So, of course, Alexander Alekhine was, the greatest chess player of his time, and possibly even one of the greatest players of all time, if not the greatest player of all time. So we have to take what he says extremely seriously. Now, that being said, we do have an extra, 70 years, well, more than that. This was played in 1930, so it's 2024 right now. We have an extra almost 100 years. So we're talking about 96 years of extra endgame knowledge. And of course, we've had chess computers and all kinds of stuff since then. To give us a better understanding of what's going on in these types of endgames. Now, we don't have these positions solved yet. That would require a nine-piece table base, which we do not possess yet. The most we have is 7. But as soon as one set of pawns gets exchanged in a position like this, we do have the position solved. So if we get down to 7 pieces, we've got it. This is a solved position. So we have a better idea of whether or not a move like h4 is bad or whether or not a move like h4 is okay. Now, what's really interesting is Stockfish thinks h4 is not just okay, h4 is actually Stockfish's top pick. And I also think h4 is a good move for completely different reasons, based off of my knowledge from books like Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual and a lot of modern endgame literature and things like that. Now, the reason for this is because when you're defending in a position like this, you have to imagine what your fortress is going to look like. And in this case, if black gets his king to f1 and the rook is attacking g2, our fortress is going to involve putting our knight on f4, because that's really the only way to defend g2. We can't do that if black gets his pawn to g5, so it makes a ton of sense to play pawn to h4 and at least make the statement that if black wants to play g5, this is going to involve a pawn exchange. And every pawn that gets exchanged gets us closer to the draw. So even if black manages to break through and even manages to capture on g2, it's not clear that he's going to be able to win with one less pawn on the board. Keep in mind, if we even just exchange these 3 pawns for these 2, a king and a knight versus a king and a rook should still be a draw. Two pieces cannot defeat 2 pieces. It's not something that can be done without a mistake from one side or the other. So h4 is actually pretty good. It's setting up different fortresses. Another thing to consider that Vidmar had to consider when he was playing pawn to h4, if he doesn't play pawn to h4, he runs into the possibility of black advancing his own pawns, say via g5, h5, h4 check, and then when this king ends up on g3, it doesn't have any air left, there's no oxygen, and then let's say you anchor your knight to e4 because that's your only anchor point. Black could even just advance his king to the f5 square, eventually play pawn to g4 check, and that knight on e4 would have nowhere to go. So this is another possibility that white has to be worried about, and because of this, h4 just makes a ton of logical sense. So I don't think Vidmar was off base trying to create his fortress by including the move 1 to h4, and it might have really been the right way to go. So we have king to e7, and then we have knight to e4, h6, which was necessary because Alekhine wanted to advance his king, and he needed to prevent knight to g5, followed by knight takes h7. So now Vidmar just says, okay, I'm hanging out. I got a fortress. I'm going to play knight f2. So king e6, knight d3. He's just shuffling his knight around these different anchor points. And as far as we can tell, this is probably the best plan. Probably Vidmar is still okay right here. White's doing fine. So knight d3, king f5, knight f4, rook a4, knight back to d3, rook to c4, knight back to f2, rook to c6, knight h3. Everything is anchored, everything's fine, king e5. Now everything is anchored here, everything is fine. Probably White just needs to keep shuffling. He can play knight f2 to e4, he can play knight f4, but Vidmar was really kind of concerned about this move rook to g6 check, and he was also trying to set up maybe a different kind of fortress, and he made this move, which turned out to be absolutely terrible. He played the move pawn to h5. And this move is probably game losing. So in this case, Alekhine's advice previously of not moving the h-pawn is actually very correct right now. And that's why, of course, we need to listen to a guy like Alexander Alekhine. When he says don't move pawns, he means it. Don't move pawns. Generally speaking, pawn moves in positions like this are bad. And so h4, but h5, definitely bad. The problem with h5 is now this pawn is a very serious weakness. It can be captured eventually. It's very difficult to defend it. And White's just not getting what he wanted to out of this. Now, what's interesting, if he doesn't push this pawn, probably White just does a fortress. I guess he was worried about the move rook to g6, but it's not even a threat. We can even just play something like knight f2 and just say, okay, what's the big deal? You play rook g6 check, we play king h3, you play king f4. I'm still hanging out on anchored squares. I have e4. e4 is anchored. How are you breaking through? It's not clear. Like if you play h5, for example, I play knight g5. Nothing's happening. I have two anchored posts now that I can move back and forth from. You cannot break through ever. I'm just playing knight g5, knight e4 all day long. If you do something else, like instead of h5, I guess you could try rook a6. I have plenty of squares to hang out. I could play knight g3 to e4 all day long. Knight h5 check, followed by knight takes g7, is also a threat. So we've got all these ideas of just basically hanging out and saying, how are you going to break through? And it's not remotely clear how black is going to break through. But after Vidmar played this move, pawn to h5, it becomes a little bit more clear how black might try to break through. So Alekhine immediately plays rook c2, which is good, and now black should have some sort of decisive advantage. White plays the move knight f4, setting up both the idea of bringing his knight to g6, but also the shot of knight to e6 followed by knight takes g7 if the black king decides to venture to the d4 square. Now Alekhine makes a mistake. He plays the move rook to d2, which is apparently incorrect. And according to the engine, and in this case I think the engine's 100% accurate, White could have achieved a draw with this move knight to g6 check. And I think the engine's 100% accurate because it's really good at calculating checks. The idea is after king to d4, the knight comes back to h4, and there is this threat of knight to f5, which would pick up this pawn on g7 if, for example, the king tries to make forward progress. If, for example, the king plays a move like king to e3. So the only move that black has apparently to stop this is to bring his king back to e5, and then of course we just repeat. We play knight to g6, king to d4, knight back to h4, and that position is equal. And unfortunately, after knight h4, if the black king tries something else, if for example king e3, we follow through with this threat of knight f5, king e2, knight takes g7, king f1, sure, we're winning the pawn on g2, but it turns out that eventually black just runs out of pawns. So king f4, rook takes g2, knight to f5, rook to g5, knight takes h6, and this position is a draw, just according to the table base. Just rook takes h5, knight f5 equal. And this position is a draw. And that's the issue. If the pawns get exchanged, and once we get to something like this, the table bases are really clear that these positions are just dead equality, and there is just no way that you're going to turn this into a win. But fortunately for Alekhine, Vidmar made a further mistake here. After rook to d2, Vidmar played the move knight to h3, I guess thinking he could create a fortress some other way. But now after king to d4, this is just decisive advantage black. After knight to d4, we have knight f4, king to e3, knight to e6. He's trying to create his fortress this way. But now rook to d5, also rook d7, apparently, just holding the pawn, would have been a winning idea as well. But rook to d5 is what Alekhine played. He's targeting this pawn on h5, and he's also kind of cleverly defending the pawn on g7. with a cross check. So if knight to g7, we have rook g5 check picking up that pawn. So instead we have Vidmar trying to hold everything by advancing his pawns. And once again, Alekhine pointed out, that with every pawn advance, these are weaknesses that black can now get into. So the further back you keep your pawns in creating this fortress, the better off you are. So if white had kept his pawns back, f3, g2, h4, and just shuffled his knight and said, okay, what are you going to do? That was white's best chance to get a draw. Now that he's being forced into moving his pawns forward, it doesn't seem like the draw is still in hand. So it seems like black is going to be able to win. So we have rook to f5, and now we're running into all kinds of problems. If the knight moves, we can capture this pawn, or we can, of course, capture the pawn on h5 at some point, at any point. And so white said, okay, I'm going to play king g4, and then we have rook f6 attacking the knight, also still threatening the pawn here. And so he just tries to hold everything. He plays pawn to f5. It was possible to play knight takes g7, but then we would have run into something like rook takes f4 check, king to g3, rook back to f6, and we start getting a kind of a funny situation. We start running out of places for our pieces to go. After king to g4, we have king e4, and then king h4, king f4. White sort of ends up in zugzwang, where his knight either has to go someplace where it's unanchored, or his king ends up getting mated. So we have something like g4, rook to d6, knight to f5, rook back to e6, knight back here, and then rook there, which of course threatens this cute little checkmate. And there's not a whole lot of great ways to stop that. So we would have something like king h3 preventing it, then rook hits the knight again, knight comes back to f5, king g5, and now of course we're just taking this pawn, and we've lost our ability to defend it, so there's no knight e3 to defend it, so we'd have something like king h2, we just take it, knight e7, king takes pawn, and this is a win. The extra pawn plus the mate threats plus the fact that this knight no longer has any place where it can anchor. It doesn't have an anchor location, and that's going to be it. So that's why you cannot really play knight takes g7. You have to play what Vidmar played here. You have to play f5, but of course f5 is almost as bad. We're going to have f5, and then we're going to have rook f7, g3, king e4, and this is the point. We're just going after this pawn. So knight c5 check, king d4, knight b3 check, king to e5, and white resigns, realizing that he's losing the pawn on f5, and he's going to have a lot of the same problems that I just discussed with the previous line with knight takes g7. If the game had continued, it would have looked something like maybe f6, because we're losing the pawn anyway. So rook takes f6, knight c5, we'll just say rook c6. It's the same issues. The knight is having to find a location, but then we're also threatening to consistently push the king back and threatening to push the king to the edge and get mate threats in a lot of cases. So for example, like knight to g6, we would have rook g5, king to h4. Here, I came up with this line on the computer, and then I looked at it, and I was like, here the computer wanted to play king f3, and it shows this really clever line where eventually black wins. It is actually just possible to play rook g6 here with a clear win. Like rook g6, h6, king f5 is game over. This is a very simple king and pawn endgame win. But the computer win's kind of cute, and it demonstrates what can happen, if you didn't just happen to have, the extra material here where you won the pawn already and it's 2-on-1 or whatever. King f3, g4, it wants to play rook g4, and then rook g5, king h4, rook f5. This is really kind of cute. Everything runs out of squares. We're threatening mate. We're threatening, to trap everything. And after knight it actually recommends knight f4, and then the computer doesn't want to take the knight. It wants to play rook g1. So I thought this was kind of cool. The idea is knight h3, rook g4 is mate, and on other knight moves, it's you're either you're getting mate in different ways. So this was the computer solution. So like another knight move, and this is actually checkmate, because the king, of course, does not have the g5 square, because that is covered by the pawn. So rook h1 is just a mate threat. So the computer didn't want to take it. So it was cute. But again, if I had to play this position, once I get here, I'm taking that knight all day long. I'm playing rook g6, h6, king f5, and we're just declaring that a win. So, basically to review how to play these positions when you're in exchange up or in exchange down, both sides at the beginning, at the outset of these positions, have to visualize how they're going to make progress, and they also have to visualize how they're going to set up their fortress. So in this case, white did a pretty good job with his first move, visualizing his fortress. He played h4, and then he just visualized a fortress where his knight just kind of hung out, and moved between his anchor points. This wasn't a bad strategy, and it avoided a couple of positions where Alekhine could have pressed for a win without the pawn on h4, as previously discussed. Alekhine could have played, g5, h5, h4 check, which would have been scary, and Alekhine also had a bunch of situations where he gets his king to f1 and attacks g2, and f4 isn't a legitimate anchor point because g5 can still get thrown in. So h4 wasn't a terrible idea, and but White really needed to stick to it when he finally got to this critical position, and he just needed to stick to his fortress and just say, okay, Black, what are you going to do? Now, if White had stuck to his fortress here, it's not actually clear exactly how Alekhine would have made progress. It would have been something that would have been interesting to see if the position was even winnable, and I guess we'll just have to wait till we get 9-piece table bases to find out. So anyways, hope you liked this video, hope you learned something new about chess, and hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.